Hi there, my name is Ryan Rakshan and I'm one of the three people behind Midnight Ceramics, and today we're going to be doing a tutorial on how to hydrate a dry mixed glaze. So if you order a dry blend glaze from us, you will get three things in the mail. You'll get a big Ziploc bag filled with 10 kilograms of glaze, which is about 22 and a half pounds, and it's just about enough to fill a 5-gallon bucket up to about here so that you still have room to dip your object and the glaze can rise up a little bit. You will also get 2 slips of paper in the mail. You'll get a label for your glaze. So this is printed on label paper and can be applied to your bucket. It's got instructions for dipping and other information for people in your studio who might want to use the glaze. And then there's also a slip of paper that has instructions for hydrating the glaze. I would highly recommend that you read this one before you start to hydrate your glaze. As far as stuff that you will need if you're going to be mixing our glazes, you're going to want at least 2 5-gallon buckets. I've got 3 here. One of them has water in it. You could just use a hose instead of this bucket that I've got, but you need 2 clean 5-gallon buckets. You need an accurate way to measure your water. So I use a 20 kilogram scale that I got off of Amazon. It's fairly inexpensive. You don't really need anything super precise for this particular task. If you wanted to use, let's say, a bucket with like graduated lines on it that tell you how many gallons you've got, or with liters, that would be good too. But if you've got a scale laying around, that's also a good idea. You're also going to need PPE. So you're going to want a 3M respirator, a P100 respirator specifically. This basically will just keep the clay dust out of your lungs. When we're working with dry clay and glaze dust, it can be dangerous and it can cause silicosis over a long period of time. So while the glaze is dry, you definitely want to be wearing your PPE. Once it's hydrated, it's not dangerous anymore. Okay. And then the very last thing that you're going to want is you're going to want a sieve for sieving the glaze. We're going to sieve our glazes twice. This one is made by Talisman. I love this sieve. It's fantastic. It's got this nice rotary sieve. If you don't want one of these, you can also pick up one of the slightly less expensive ones that you might find at your local clay supplier. They're around 25 bucks. They're also made by Talisman, and they sit on the inside of the bucket. Those are, I would recommend a 60 or an 80 mesh sieve. So without further ado, I'm going to bring you guys in here. I'm going to do a really quick demo on how to hydrate a glaze. And then after that, super fast, like these are the steps of hydrating a glaze, I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about ways that you might want to fine tune your glaze or things that you can do to make your glaze work better in your studio. So on our directions here, they're calling for 6,700 milliliters or 1.77 gallons of water for this 10 kilogram batch of Sexy Mermaid. And let's see, milliliters are the same as grams, so 1 gram of water is the same as 1 milliliter of water. So I'm just going to start adding water into this bucket. Okay, this doesn't have to be the most precise thing in the world. As long as you're kind of close to 6,700 or whatever that sheet of paper calls for, you'll be good. So now that we've got our water measured out, we're going to put on our PPE and we're going to start to pour our glaze onto our water. Okay, so now we're actually going to wait for a little while before we begin to stir our glaze. What happens if you start stirring directly after you've poured your glaze material on top of your water is you can seal off little chunks of glaze, which makes them really difficult to move through a sieve because you get these chunky pieces. So what you want to do is you want to wait while your glaze settles down into your water, and you want to wait for the bubbles to stop rising from the water, and then it'll be time to move on to the next step. Okay, so now that we've waited for the glaze to slake, I personally like to use a drill to mix my glazes before I sieve them. But if you don't have one, or if you don't have a drill attachment, it's fine. You can do this without the drill. Some people are taught not to use a drill attachment when they're mixing their glaze, and the reasoning for this is because it breaks down the particles of the glaze a lot smaller than the sieve might otherwise break them down. And one of the reasons that I really like to use them is because a lot of the time those particles will break down over time anyways. So particles like titanium, which are really hard to break down with just a sieve, as they break down, they make the glaze more opaque. And your glaze can change over time as those particles are slowly kind of hydrating and pulling apart over several months while they sit in your bucket. But if you use a drill right at the beginning of the process, you can kind of get to that final stage. And most of our glazes here at Midnight Ceramics, we've tested by using a drill attachment to break them down right at the beginning. So now we are ready to sieve our glaze. I have a 60 mesh insert in here. Just as simple as pouring our glaze into our sieve. Okay, so we've sieved our glaze one time now, and before we sieve it back into this bucket, we're going to clean this bucket out because if there were any chunks left over in the bottom of that bucket, we don't want them to wind up in our final product. So we'll clean this bucket out, we'll pull the sieve from this bucket onto this bucket, we'll sieve the glaze a second time, and it should be just about ready to go. And the very last thing that we'll do is we'll apply our label to our bucket. And we should be good to go. Stay tuned if you want to learn a little bit more about adding water to our glaze, if we need to add water, flocculating, and some of the other issues that you might come into if you are wanting to customize a glaze. But if you just wanted to know how to hydrate a glaze that you have purchased from us, this is all you need to know, and you should be ready to dip. So some studios like their glazes thicker or thinner than we like ours, and some people might want to water a glaze down a little bit. Now we've done lots of testing in deciding how much water should be added to our glazes, but that being said, sometimes it kind of comes down to a matter of taste. Some people like thinner glazes. Now, if you want to add water to our glazes, you can. There are two things that you should know about, though. If you add too much water to a glaze, what can happen is you can get something called crawling. And crawling is kind of that where the glaze peels apart in the kiln and kind of peels off of the surface of the pot. And the reason that that happens is because as the glaze is applying to the pot after you've dipped it, there's so much water in the glaze that it saturates the walls of your bisqueware, and there's nowhere else for that water to go. So it kind of lingers on the surface of the pot, and the pot stays wet for a really long time. And the longer that that glaze stays wet on the surface of the pot, the more that it kind of shrinks on the surface of the pot. If your water gets sucked into your pot really quickly, like if there isn't too much water in the bisqueware, as that water gets sucked out of the glaze and into the pot, the glaze all kind of compacts down onto the surface of the pot. Whereas if that water is mingling on the surface of the pot for a really long time, and if the pot stays wet for a really long time, it kind of shrinks sideways, and you get these little fissures in the surface of the glaze, and then it peels apart in the kiln. So that's the first thing that you need to know about with adding more water to a glaze. The second thing that you want to know about is that the more water that's in a glaze, the more that it'll settle out as it sits. So if you have a glaze with very little water in it that's kind of goopy, it'll stay suspended for a really long time because there isn't room for each individual particle to filter down through all the other particles and sink down to the bottom of the bucket. But if you've got lots and lots of water, there's lots of water between all the particles, so they're far apart, and so they can all kind of trickle down to the bottom and move their way past each other, and they can settle more easily. So that's the second thing. That being said, with that second one, you can prevent that a little bit by flocculating your glaze. Now, this is going to get really nerdy for a second, and I apologize, but I think it's super fun, so I would love to communicate it to you all. Glazes have clay in them generally as like an ingredient, like the mineral form of clay. And clay is, a lot of people know, it's like flat little hexagons, and they have charges on their surfaces. And those charges are positive and negative, and they tend to attract each other. And we can alter how strong those charges are. So by flocculating our glaze, what we're actually doing is we're strengthening the charge on the surface of the clay molecules, or the clay particles. So you can flocculate by adding Epsom salts to your glaze, and what you would do is you would take about maybe a tablespoon to 2 tablespoons of Epsom salts, dissolve it in about a cup of water, and then as you're stirring your glaze, you can slowly pour some of that water that's super saturated with Epsom salts into the glaze. And what should happen is the glaze will actually thicken up. And what's happening is as those as the clay particles, as the charges on their surfaces are strengthening, they're kind of starting to stand at attention, and they're all making this like grid-like pattern that kind of gels nicely in the glaze. So the more that you flocculate your glaze, the more that those clay particles kind of stick together and they form this. It's more of a like a goopy consistency rather than a very watery, sandy, silty consistency. So if you want to thin your glaze out a little bit, you can add a few hundred more milliliters of water. But then if your glaze starts settling out really bad and you're having trouble with your glaze sinking to the bottom of the bucket when you're not stirring it, you might want to think about grabbing some Epsom salts from the local pharmacy, dissolving them in some water, and mixing them in. So that's flocculation. And the very last thing that I want to talk about is the fact that I used a drill to mix the glaze. I personally have been told to or not to use a drill, and I have just found through my experience that I really like using a drill. What it does is it's a different type of force that's breaking apart the clay or the glaze particles when you're mixing the glaze. When we're forcing our glaze through a sieve, we're just kind of mechanically separating those particles by kind of slicing them with a wire. That's the wire that's in the sieve. Whereas if we use a drill and we're spinning it real fast, we're getting something called a shear force. And that shears as in like scissors, right? So it's an incredibly powerful force that has the potential to break up our particles much smaller than we could with the average sieve that we can pick up at the local pottery supply store. Now the reason that some people don't like this is because they want large particles in their glaze because it might give them more character or like more granularity in their glaze. But I have personally found that a glaze that sits for a long time that was not drilled, eventually the water will kind of get down into those particles and break them up on their own anyways. So you may have a glaze that behaves one way right after you've mixed it and sieved it, and then after it's sat for a month or 2 months, and then you go to use it again, or even if you're using it this whole time, the longer that it sits, the more that the particles break apart, and the glaze can start to behave completely differently. So I prefer to break up those particles in the first place so that I have a very consistent glaze over time. One of the big culprits for that is titanium, which is an opacifier. So titanium, unless you run it through a drill, it tends to have really fairly large particles. And the smaller that we break down those particles, the more opaque the glaze becomes. So one of our glazes, like say toasted arsenic, If you don't run it through a drill, it's very transparent, very like brown. You get a lot of those deep mahogany shades. But if you use a drill on it, you're going to get more of the blue, kind of greenish blue shades that we tend to get with toasted arsenic. So that's kind of, those are the extra little tidbits that I have that I like to add at the end of things like this. If you have any questions for us, hit us up on Instagram or via email. Either of those works really well, and I am happy to answer any questions that you all might have. So anyways, thanks for tuning in, and hopefully I'll hear from you all soon.